The sun had bleached the world around me to a muted, dusty canvas. My coat, once a sturdy brown, now matched the road, and my beard a constant reminder of the weeks I'd let slip by without a thought. For appearances felt like a tangled nest against my weathered skin. My eyes squinted from years of staring across vast empty plains, saw everything and nothing. I rode into Redstone Crossing with the same slow, deliberate pace I applied to every chore that kept my ranch from crumbling into dust. My mule team, tired and resigned, plodded along their hooves, kicking up little puffs of red earth. I didn't come to town to see people. People with their laughter and their gossip and their easy forgetting were a luxury I couldn't afford. I came for salt coffee lamp oil nails. And a new whetstone. The old one had cracked clean through a small, insignificant break that felt like a metaphor for my life. In and out, no delays. That was my mantra. The last time I'd lingered past sundown, some drunk had dredged up the war, the dead, and my part as a Union scout. The words had tasted like ash in my mouth, and I'd simply walked away. There was nothing to say. Nothing that could change a damn thing. My wife Clara had been gone 10 years. 10 years. Her grave sat on a lonely hill behind the cabin, marked by a simple cross I'd fashioned with my own hands and a stone I'd turned over myself. The ranch, half alive on its best days, sometimes less, was my penance, my mission. Keep it standing. Keep the fence rails mended. Keep myself fed. Keep the days moving in a straight, predictable line. That was all I had left. I would have gone straight to the general store, but a commotion from the old livery yard snagged my attention. A knot of men, some braying with laughter, some spitting tobacco juice, others just standing with that vacant, cruel attention that fills the void when there's nothing else to do. Cruelty, I'd learned, was a cheap way to pass the time. I didn't slow because I wanted to. I slowed because the path narrowed with their bodies, and because I heard the words auction, last one left worthless. My hands tightened on the reins just a fraction before I set the brake and stepped down. Then I saw her. She was chained to a rough-hewn post, her wrists raw, and bruised, the iron biting into her skin. But she stood, upright. Not stiff, not slumped, just upright. Her chin was level, her eyes clear, and focused on nothing in front of her, as if she'd learned it was safer to look through men than at them. Her dress, deerskin with fringe that had once been meticulously placed, was torn. Beads and feathers still clung in some spots, remnants of a life that had been violently ripped away. The neckline was ripped so far down it exposed the top of her chest, the curve of her cleavage. There was no attempt to cover it. No extra cloth, no modesty left to protect her. Modesty, I knew, hadn't protected anyone from anything out here. Her skin held the color of the country she came from, sun-warmed copper. The muscles along her bare arms and calves spoke of a life of work, of walking, of not breaking. She was young, maybe 24. Her hair was black, long and tangled, parts of it braided, parts pulled loose by days of wind and rough handling. The men had been jeering her. I could see it in the set of their mouths, the careless way they leaned in. But she hadn't reacted. She hadn't given them anything. She ain't spoke a word. A man near me grunted, not looking at me, just announcing it to the stale air. 3 days. Others sold quick. Not her. Wouldn't kneel. Wouldn't cry. Just stands there. He spat a thick wad of tobacco, hitting the dirt. Folks say she's cursed or stubborn or both. My jaw worked once. I didn't answer. I stepped closer, my boots sinking a fraction into the dry soil. Her eyes shifted, then finally, and landed on me. There was no plea there. No hope, no friendliness, no relief. Just a read of me, fast and exact. The way a person checks for threat and decides what to do next. I knew that look. I'd worn it after the war. I still wore it some mornings when I woke, and had to remember there was nothing chasing me anymore but memory. I could leave. I knew I could. I could buy my nails and coffee and go home and pretend I hadn't seen her. I would mend fence rails and oil my lantern and sit by the fire thinking about nothing in particular until Sunday, when I walked up to Clara's grave and told her nothing had changed. But I also knew this. If I left, she would still be there when the sun went down, and some man with less patience and less restraint would have coins in his pocket and ideas in his head, and the outcome would be certain. I reached inside my coat. My fingers found the folded bills and a few coins I'd counted twice that morning. I stepped to the man who seemed to be handling the trade. How much? I asked, my voice low from disuse, a rasp in the quiet air. The man blinked, surprised both that I spoke and that anyone was interested. He named a number that was less than what I had in my hand, but more than the woman was worth to him after 3 days of not selling. I didn't haggle. I put the money in the man's palm. He shrugged, satisfied with something for nothing, and bent to unlock the chains. "You want a bill of sale?" the man asked, his voice flat. "No," I said. The chains fell. The weight left her wrists, but she didn't rub them. She didn't move until I turned away. Then she stepped forward because standing there wasn't safer than following, and because every choice left to her was a bad one, but some were worse. I didn't touch her. I didn't guide her. I didn't say anything. I walked back to the wagon and climbed up. She climbed in after me and sat on the plank seat, her hands resting in her lap, her shoulders steady. She glanced at the coat I wore, then away. I noticed the cold coming in from the north and the way her torn dress would handle it. I took off my coat and held it toward her. She stared at it, then at me, and finally she took it but didn't put it on, just held it over her legs. We left Redstone Crossing with the sound of boots and laughter fading behind us. Nobody followed. The mule team moved on the road in a rhythm I knew by heart, and neither of us said a thing for miles. My mind kept circling back to my land, what needed repairing. How much feed was left, the broken hinge on the chicken coop door, the way winter would close in fast this year, if the sky stayed the way it was. I glanced once at her wrists. The skin was raw. I watched her glance toward the horizon and then down at her hands. She kept her face still. I wondered how long she had been moving through the world, keeping her face still. Her name, I would learn later, was River. She had been taken in a raid, dragged through miles of scrub and rock, stripped of language by men who laughed when she didn't answer, and left unsold because pride does not move itself for the sake of anyone's comfort. Her mission now, if the word could even fit, was to stay alive without giving up the last of what made her feel like herself. She would not kneel. She would not beg. She would not say please to men who had none to offer. Survival without bending. That was the line in her head, thin but unbroken. My mission had been simple for years. Keep the ranch breathing. Keep myself useful enough to justify another day. Keep my dead wife remembered, without letting the grave swallow the rest of my years. Buying her hadn't been in that plan, and I wasn't sure what it meant now that I had. But I knew I hadn't brought her home to own her. And I knew the cabin had room for another bed. And I knew the silence in that place had gotten too heavy to carry much longer. Dusk laid a flat orange light over my land when we arrived. The fence line leaned, the pasture grass was thin, the barn door stuck if I didn't lift it just right. I pulled the wagon to a stop near the well. Climbed down. She waited, watching my hands, studying what I did and how I moved. I offered a hand to help her down. She looked at it, didn't take it, stepped down on her own, her bare feet hitting the packed dirt. A flash of pain crossed her eyes when the ground bit at the raw spots, and then it was gone again. I opened the cabin door and stepped aside, letting her go first, so she could see the space before I moved into it. The cabin was one room with a short wall built halfway across it to suggest separation, a wood stove that needed a new seal, a table I had built myself with uneven legs, 2 beds mine, and a smaller one I had made when Clara got sick and couldn't climb in and out of the higher frame. I gestured toward that bed. "Yours," I said, "if you want it." I didn't say anything about the door staying unlocked or locked, or about chores, or about where she could and couldn't go. I didn't draw rules because I didn't know yet what she needed. And I wasn't going to pretend ownership gave me the right to decide it. She stood still, taking everything in, the stove, the bed, the small shelf against the far wall, with a folded shirt and a basin on it, the window with a nailed-down shutter, the smell of wood smoke and oil, and the faint trace of a woman's soap that lingered on things I hadn't thrown away. Her eyes stopped for a second on a ring that lay on the table. Not worn, just kept. I followed her gaze, then looked away. I slid the ring into my pocket without comment. "I'll make food," I said, my voice rough. "You can wash, basin's there, water's clean." I ladled stew into 2 bowls thick with beans and the last of the summer squash. I set 1 bowl near her bed and 1 on the table for myself. I didn't sit across from her. I gave her space to decide where to eat. She chose the floor by the fire, cross-legged, my coat across her lap, her eyes on the flames. I sat at the table. The room held 2 people in a silence that wasn't hostile, only heavy with new facts. I ate slow, listening to the scrape of her spoon against the tin. I thought about the next morning, animals to feed, fences to check, wood to split. I thought about whether she would want to help or prefer to be left alone. I thought about the men in Redstone and how quick they had been to label her useless when what they meant was she wouldn't pretend to be less than she was. When the bowls were empty, I took them, washed them, set them to dry. I laid an extra blanket on the end of her bed and a second one on the chair nearby in case she didn't want to sleep in the bed at all. I pulled a rough plank and a stack of old feed sacks from against the wall, measured the space with my eyes, and started planning where to build a proper divider in the morning so she would have privacy without needing to ask. I didn't say it. I just noted the measurements in my head. Night settled without ceremony. I banked the fire, blew out the lamp. The cabin sank into a low orange glow. She lay on the small bed, eyes open. I lay on a larger one, staring at the roof beams I had cut myself, counting the knots the way I always did when sleep didn't come. I heard her breath even out, but not deepen. She wasn't sleeping either. Both of us were listening to the stove, to the night outside, to each other's quiet presence. I thought of Clara's grave on the hill, and how I would walk up there on Sunday and stand with my hat in my hands and tell my wife the truth. I brought someone home because leaving her there felt like leaving you, and I couldn't do that again. I felt the old guilt rise and settle. I let it sit. I didn't push it away. I didn't let it rule me either. River stared at the ceiling and tried to slow her heart because the sound of a door shutting in darkness still put her back in places she didn't want to remember. And the smell of a strange man's space still made her hands twitch, ready to fight. And yet there had been no hand on her arm, no order, no threat. I had given her a bed and a coat and silence. She decided to stay awake long enough to hear if I moved toward her. I didn't. Hours passed. The fire settled to coals. The cold pressed at the walls. Neither of us slept, but neither of us left. In the morning we would work. We didn't know it yet, but the work would become our language. For now, surviving the first night under the same roof without fear or demand was enough. That was the start. That was the mission on both sides. Stay. Do no harm. Make the space livable. See if trust could exist without being forced into existence. The next morning broke cold. I woke to the sound of the wind pushing against the wooden walls and the faint pop of cooling embers in the stove. I turned my head just slightly and saw her. River curled on her side on the small bed across the room, my old coat tucked around her knees. Her eyes were shut, not deeply asleep, but resting. The faintest furrow in her brow told me enough. She'd stayed awake most of the night, same as me. I sat up, joints aching the way they did every morning now. The floor was cold under my bare feet. I moved quietly, not to be courteous, but because noise had long ago stopped being necessary in my life. I dressed, pulled on my boots, stoked the fire, and put water on to boil. When I stepped outside, the air bit deep, dry, high country cold. The sky was clear. The pasture stretched toward the hills in a brittle line of yellowed grass and rusted fence posts. I fed the mules, tossed a cracked bucket of oats to the hens, and checked the lean-to where a busted hinge still needed mending. Everything was where I left it, quiet, tired, in need of repair. But there was another set of footprints in the dirt, now smaller, barefoot. When I returned to the cabin, River was awake, sitting upright, legs pulled in close, her long hair curtaining part of her face. The coat still covered her, but the torn dress underneath showed more than it hid. I glanced once, then looked away, not out of discomfort, but respect. She didn't try to cover herself. She hadn't moved the cot. She hadn't touched anything. Her hands were folded in her lap. I made coffee, I said, setting a tin cup near her bed. No sugar. She looked at the cup but didn't reach for it. I didn't press. I sat down at the table with my own and took a sip, wincing slightly at the heat. I needed to say something. I wasn't sure what. She hadn't spoken since the auction. I didn't even know if she spoke English. I doubted it was fluent, if at all. But there were things she needed to know even without language. I'll be fixing the fence line today. Got a section down up past the north trail. After that, the chicken coop needs a new hinge. There's tools outside if you know them. She said nothing. She only blinked once slowly. You can stay here if you want, I added. Or come. Your choice. I didn't tell her she was free. I didn't know if she'd believe me. Freedom was a word too many men used before doing the opposite of what they promised. I just laid the facts down plain as I could. She eventually stood slowly, stretching her legs with a quiet stiffness that said she was used to sitting too long in one position. Her bare feet touched the floor with hesitation, and I noted the redness on her soles. I crossed to a shelf, pulled out a pair of worn moccasins too small for me, kept from when Clara had once tried to learn leather work, and laid them by the edge of her bed. They might fit, I said. If not, I'll fix them. She looked down at them, then up at me. She didn't thank me, but she gave the faintest nod. It was enough. I went out, started working. By the time I was halfway to the north fence line, she was behind me, walking slowly, wrapped in the coat, the moccasins on her feet, her hair braided back now. She didn't ask what to do. She watched me work, watched the way I drove the post deeper, tied the wire, reset the support beams. After maybe an hour without a word, she picked up a second post and began helping. Her hands were rough, capable. She had done this kind of labor before. We worked without speaking. The wind carried dust around our boots. I handed her a mallet when hers cracked. She didn't smile, didn't look grateful, just accepted it and kept swinging. When we rested, I poured water into a shared canteen and held it out. She drank carefully, then gave it back. That afternoon, we returned to the cabin. I chopped wood behind the barn. River knelt near the chicken coop, inspecting the hinge. She disappeared for a moment and came back with wire and a rusted nail. Fix it herself. I didn't say anything. Just watched her go inside quietly, deliberately. She didn't eat much that night. A few bites of salted pork, a biscuit. She ate slowly, chewing like she had to remind herself to do it. Her eyes didn't stray far from me, never suspicious but aware. I cleared the table and lit the oil lamp. I took out wood and nails and started measuring space near the cot. She sat nearby, arms around her knees, silent as I worked, hammering slowly. She finally spoke. Her voice was soft, cracked from disuse. "Why?" I paused. She said again, firmer. "Why'd you take me?" I set the hammer down and looked at her. My eyes were tired but steady. "Because no one else should have," I said. "And because I had room." She stared at me for a moment, then lowered her gaze. "I don't want to be owned," she said, her voice a low, fierce murmur. "You're not wife. Number. Not slave. Number." She nodded once, sharp and final. That was the deal. That was enough for now. Later that night, I sat by the fire, slowly cleaning an old bridle. River moved toward the stove, placed a blanket near it, and lay down on the floor instead of the cot. When I looked at her, she said nothing, just stared at the ceiling. I left her be. She didn't trust the bed. That was fine. Trust would take time, I knew that. I didn't expect her to feel safe here. I only hoped she'd learn she didn't have to run anymore. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance. Inside, the warmth of the fire spread slowly across the floorboards. I looked over once before turning in. Her eyes were still open, watching the dark beams above. She wasn't afraid. Not exactly. Just alert. And she hadn't run. That was something. Tomorrow would come. So would the next one. If she stayed, I'd build the divider higher, fix the roof over the shed, make another cot. If she left, I wouldn't stop her. But she hadn't left. And I hadn't asked her to. That was where we were. Not family. Not strangers, something in between. Not bound by words or paper, but by the fact that neither one of us had walked away. Not yet, and maybe not ever. Morning came with frost edging the windows. The fire had died down to a low heat, but the cabin still held some of yesterday's warmth. I stirred early, as always, sliding out of bed in practiced silence. When I glanced across the room, I saw her still on the floor beside the stove. She was curled under the blanket, one hand tucked beneath her head, the other resting lightly over her chest. Her breathing was even, her eyes closed. He dressed and stepped outside to start the morning chores. A layer of ice had formed over the water trough, thin but solid enough to need breaking. I used the heel of my boot, then filled 2 buckets to bring inside. There was a rhythm to the morning, tending to animals, splitting, kindling, checking that nothing had gone wrong overnight. And I moved through it with the same deliberateness I always had. Only now I was aware of her presence in a way that tugged slightly at each thought. Not a burden, not a distraction, just a new shape in the old life. I came back inside. She was already up, standing by the window, her arms crossed, still wrapped in the coat I'd given her. She didn't startle when I entered, but her body went a little tenser, like she didn't trust any room not to shift beneath her. I set the buckets down near the basin. "There's hot water on the stove," I said, my voice low. "If you want to wash up proper." She didn't answer, just nodded once and stepped away. I turned my back and gave her space. While she cleaned herself slowly, cautiously, using the warm water and a scrap of cloth, I busied myself with the stove, frying leftover salt pork and grinding coffee beans. When she finished, she returned the basin to its place and moved back to the far wall. I noticed she had cleaned her face and arms. Her hair was damp, brushed back. Her cheeks were red from scrubbing, but her shoulders were less rigid. We ate at the table this time, not speaking but not avoiding either, just eating. She watched me in between bites, her eyes moving over the lines of my face, the way I held my fork, how methodically I chewed. I noticed but said nothing. Afterward, I pointed toward the barn. "I'll be clearing the south pen. The snow's coming early this year." "I'll come," she said, surprising me. Her voice was firmer than before. Not strong, not warm, just sure. I didn't argue. I simply pulled on my coat and handed her a pair of work gloves. She accepted them without expression. We spent most of the day in a yard behind the barn where broken wood and old fencing had been piled in disuse. I hadn't gotten around to sorting it the year before. Now River and I moved the scrap together. She hauled what she could, her hands still raw but steady. I caught her grimace a few times but never heard a complaint. At midday we sat on a log and shared a piece of dried meat and bread. The wind had picked up. She pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders. I studied the sky. "You ever work a ranch?" before I asked, finally, my voice breaking the comfortable silence. She was slow to respond. "My father had sheep, not cattle, but I worked." I nodded. "I can tell." She glanced at me, then back at her hands. "Why do you live alone?" I shifted. The question didn't sting. It just came from farther away than I'd expected. "My wife died a long time ago." River's face didn't change, but her eyes dropped to the dirt. "You had children. Number." She nodded like she understood something unspoken. Like that explained everything. After a moment she said, "They sold me because I wouldn't obey. I wasn't quiet enough." I didn't answer, just watched her face. There was no tear in her voice, no pity in the telling. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was just saying what needed to be said so it wouldn't rot inside her. I said, "You don't have to be quiet here." She looked at me again, long and hard. "Even if I speak against you?" she asked, her gaze piercing. I met her gaze evenly. "You can say what you need." That night she slept on the cot instead of the floor. I noticed when I rose to bank the fire before bed, she had pulled the blankets tight to her chest. Her arm curled under her cheek. She looked more at peace than she had any night prior. I didn't mention it the next morning. Didn't bring it up at all, but I left a folded shirt by her bed. Soft cotton, something Clara had once sewn for herself but never wore. River picked it up, held it to her chest, then laid it aside. That day she helped me mend the chicken pen. She collected the eggs. She swept the cabin when I went to the pasture. Later, as dusk came, she stood at the threshold of the cabin staring toward the western hills. I came up behind her quietly. "You looking for something?" I asked. She answered without looking back. "Sometimes I think I'll see someone. My sister maybe, or a scout. Something from before, but it never comes." I nodded. I looked too. Every Sunday. She turned then, her brow drawn slightly. "For her." I didn't answer out loud, just nodded. We stood there in the doorway together as the sun dipped low. Side by side, not touching, not speaking more. But something had shifted. We were no longer two strangers under the same roof. We were two people beginning to share a life. Uneven, quiet, but real. In town they'd called her unsellable. Here she was, learning to be seen. And I, Caleb Thorne, the man who hadn't spoken more than 5 words a day for 10 years, was learning that staying didn't have to mean staying buried in the past. The following days unfolded without incident, but something had changed between us, subtle as it was. The silence was still there, but it had softened. River no longer kept her back to me when she moved through the cabin. She no longer flinched when I came in from the yard. I noticed how she began tidying without being asked, stacking firewood, sweeping out the corners, brushing down the mule's coat after he came in from the field. She didn't act like a guest or a servant. She simply moved like someone who had decided for now to stay. The shirt I'd left by her bed was being worn now loosely over the torn dress. The sleeves were too long and the fabric hung low over her curves, but she didn't seem to mind. It covered her more than before, though her deerskin dress still peeked from underneath. Worn frayed, especially at the neckline. The rip across her chest hadn't been repaired. When she bent forward, the fabric parted slightly, exposing the warm curve of her cleavage. I caught myself looking once, just once, then forced my gaze to the floor. She didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did and simply didn't care anymore. The tension between us wasn't desire. It was something slower, weightier. It came from sharing space without force, from surviving together in silence. On Thursday, she followed me out to the far field where the fencing needed mending. The sun was harsh that day, and she worked with sleeves rolled up, sweat trailing down the line of her throat. I offered her water. She drank without hesitation. Then we kept working. Midway through the afternoon, she asked something that caught me off guard. What happened to her? Her voice was quiet but clear. Your wife. I didn't answer right away. I kept tying wire to the post, then leaned back against the fence and wiped my brow. Fever, I said finally, the word tasting dry. Got sick one spring. Didn't get better. She lasted 6 days. Buried her behind the cabin. River looked toward the tree line. No children. Number, no family. None that stayed. She nodded slowly, like that made sense. Same. We stood in the field, wind rustling the grass around us. The sun shifting lower in the sky. I asked, your tribe. They think you're dead. She didn't answer for a long time. Then maybe. Or they wish I were. I was supposed to marry someone. I refused. They said I dishonored my father. After the raid, no one came looking. That was all she said. It was enough. When we returned to the cabin that evening, River washed at the basin while I lit the lamp and stirred the stew. I watched her in the glass. Reflection, her long hair loose, now her collarbone, visible through the open shirt, the scars and marks that told quiet stories I didn't ask to hear. Her body was strong but no longer guarded. There was still war in her, but it wasn't against me anymore. After dinner, she sat by the fire, cross-legged, her eyes half-lidded in thought. I sat in the chair behind her, my hands working slowly on a broken strap of leather. The fire crackled. A long time passed before she spoke again. I don't know what I am here. She continued, her voice low, a fragile whisper. Not a wife, not a slave, not part of a tribe. I wake up, I work, I eat, but I don't know what I'm becoming. I set the leather down and leaned forward, elbows on my knees. You're someone who's still standing, I said, my voice firm. That's more than most. She turned toward me, her expression unreadable. And you? Where are you now? I thought about it, the weight of the years pressing down. Tired, I said, but trying. The corner of her mouth twitched. Almost a smile. Almost. Later, as the fire burned down and the shadows stretched longer across the floor, she moved closer to me. Not quickly, not directly, but with purpose. She sat beside my chair on the floor, near enough that our knees nearly touched. I didn't move. My heart was beating slow but heavy. She placed her hand over my rough palm against calloused knuckles. I looked down at our joined hands, then at her. She didn't speak. I didn't pull away. That night she slept in the cot again. But before she lay down, she reached out and touched my arm as I passed by. Just a small touch, a thank you, or something else entirely. I lay awake longer than usual, listening to the quiet of the cabin, the steady breathing across the room. I didn't know what we were becoming. I only knew that the silence between us no longer felt hollow. It felt like the start of something that didn't need a name yet, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't visit Clara's grave the next morning. I stayed inside, and so did she. The snow came earlier than expected. It began as a thin flurry just before dawn, fine white dust brushing against the window glass. By midday, it thickened into a slow, steady fall that blanketed the ridgelines and softened the edges of the pasture. I stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching it coat the fence posts. It was quiet still, the kind of quiet that pressed into your chest. Inside the cabin, River stirred the fire, her shirt sleeves rolled up, hair braided tight down her back. She moved differently now, still alert, still guarded, but not like she was waiting for something to break. She moved like she lived there. I came in, stomping the snow off my boots. She handed me a warm cup of broth without a word. I nodded, grateful. Our routines had settled into something close to rhythm. I still rose early and took care of the livestock. She cleaned, mended, prepared meals when she felt like it, and joined in the fields when the weather allowed. But something unspoken had begun to shift. Neither of us had said it out loud, but the touches were more frequent now. A hand brushed against a shoulder when passing. A quiet moment at the table when our eyes stayed locked a little too long. It wasn't romantic in the way stories tell it. It was quieter, slower earned. That evening, as the storm thickened and the wind beat harder against the cabin walls, River pulled her bedding closer to the fire. She wore the same patched deerskin dress beneath my shirt. The shirt gaped slightly at the chest now that the buttons were worn. The heat from the fire had made her skin flush faintly, and the curve of her neckline was visible in the lamplight. I noticed, but not with hunger. It was something closer to sorrow, like looking at something that deserved better than it had ever been given. I never asked where you learned to mend fences, I said suddenly. River glanced up. My grandfather taught me. He said, if you could fix a fence, you could keep anything alive. Livestock people. I nodded, then sipped from my cup. After a moment, she asked, why don't you ever go to town, not even for church? I shrugged slightly. There's nothing there for me. Town doesn't change. I did. She tilted her head. People talk about you, I know. They say you went mad after the war. I set the cup down. I came back with less than I left with. That's not madness. That's math. River didn't smile, but she understood. She moved closer to the fire. The lamp flickered low. She sat near my feet now, her legs tucked beneath her, one hand on the floor, steadying herself. I used to think silence was punishment, she said quietly. After I was taken, they didn't speak to me unless commanded. I stopped speaking too. It was easier. I looked at her, my voice low. Here, silence isn't punishment. It's peace. She looked at me for a long time, then nodded slowly. That night, she stood before the stove, waiting for the coals to settle. I sat behind her, rubbing my palms together from the chill. She turned to me, took a step closer, then another. I didn't move, just watched her. She reached out, placed a hand on my chest, flat and warm, right over the place where my heartbeat lived. Her eyes didn't ask anything. They just looked. My voice was barely above a whisper. Are you sure? She nodded. I stayed, and with that she leaned in, pressing her lips softly to mine. It wasn't long. It wasn't heated, just real present, a choice. I didn't pull her in further. I didn't lead. I let her decide everything. She pulled back after a moment and stepped away back to the cot. She didn't say goodnight. I sat there long after the fire settled my chest tight. Not from desire, but from something heavier. The sense that for the first time in years I might not be alone anymore, and that she might finally feel the same. By morning the snow covered everything in sight. But inside the cabin something had warmed, and neither of us would name it. Not yet, but both had stopped looking at the door. By the second week of snow, the road into Redstone was iced over and impassable. The ranch became its own world, white still and sealed off. I kept the fire burning through the day, hauling and chopping wood twice daily. River swept boiled broth, patched torn blankets, and mended leather straps by the window while the storm outside howled like a voice trying to call us back to a life neither of us missed. Inside, we moved around each other without the old stiffness. We didn't speak much, but when we did, the words came easier. I didn't ask her about the men who had taken her. River didn't ask what I had done during the war. We shared everything but the pain that had come before, because that didn't need explaining. She slept in the cot still, but each night she placed it closer to the fire and closer to my own bed. She didn't say why. I didn't ask. But when the fire crackled low at night and her hand dangled over the edge, she no longer pulled it back if my hand brushed hers. One evening, the lamp burned low and snow fell thick outside. I was at the table sharpening my knife. River sat across from me, running her fingers down a line of old cotton cloth she'd salvaged from mending. My shirt hung loose, exposing the curve of her chest through the torn dress beneath it. I didn't look away this time, and she didn't hide. Her voice broke the silence. Was she beautiful? She asked, her gaze steady on me. Your wife. I blinked once. Yes, but not like people mean when they say that. River tilted her head, waiting. She was quiet, strong, didn't need anything from anyone, but she stayed anyway. River looked down at the table. You still think about her? Every Sunday, I said, but lately less, like I'm holding on more, like I'm letting her rest. A long pause followed. She stood, moved toward the fire, and knelt to stoke it. Her shirt fell open slightly with the motion. When she turned back, her eyes stayed on me longer than usual. I've been thinking, she said, her voice barely a whisper. If I asked to stay not just for winter but longer, what would you say? I set the knife down. I'd say you already are. That answer seemed to settle something between us. She didn't speak again. She simply moved back across the room and sat beside me, not across from me. She rested her hand on my leg, fingers light, unsure. I covered it with my own. That night we didn't say goodnight. When the lamp was turned down and the fire glowed low, she stepped over to my bed. No words, just her hand resting against my chest again, this time with more certainty. I sat up, met her eyes. You don't owe me anything, I said quietly, my voice raspy. She shook her head once. I know. I moved over, pulled back the blanket, and she slid beside me carefully, slowly. Her skin was warm, soft against the rough wool. We lay there shoulder to shoulder, silent for a long time. Neither moved. Then she turned toward me, placed her hand on my jaw, and kissed me longer this time. I kissed her back carefully, like touching something half broken that had been repaired too many times. Our bodies pressed together beneath the blanket, close but unhurried. She let her hand move to my chest, and I let mine drift to her waist. Our breathing deepened when I touched her collarbone and traced downward. I paused, giving her space to say no. She didn't. What followed was not rushed or desperate. It was slow, steady, quiet. River moved, first letting her shirt fall, letting my hands find the warmth beneath her curves against my chest, her breath in my ear, my hands firm but careful, steady, as everything else I'd ever built. When we came together, it was not possession but return. Two people who had been taken apart by life, choosing for once not to run. Her body curled against mine, her breathing deep, and even afterward, I held her until she fell asleep. My arms wrapped around her bare back, the fire still glowing at our feet. It was the first night neither of us had dreamt of before. Only what might come next. Morning light slipped through the frost-glazed window panes, casting a cold glow across the cabin's wooden floorboards. The fire had burned down to a faint orange pulse in the hearth, and the snow outside stretched in soft drifts over every surface, muffling the world into stillness. Inside, I lay awake. River's body pressed lightly against my side, her dark hair spilling over my shoulder. She was breathing softly, her cheek against my chest, the blanket drawn up to her waist. Her hand rested on my ribs, unmoving, familiar. It was the first morning in years that I didn't rise immediately with the sun. I stayed still, present, grounded. Her warmth beside me felt like something earned. Eventually she stirred. She didn't speak at first, only shifted her head slightly to look up at me, her expression open calm. There was no embarrassment in her eyes. No hesitation. I met her gaze with a quiet nod, my hand gently moving to the back of her shoulder, resting there. "You didn't leave," she murmured, her voice husky from sleep. "Didn't plan to," I said. She looked away for a moment, thinking. Then, "No man I've known ever stayed after they got what they wanted. I'm not like those men." "I know." We sat up slowly, the cold air biting at our skin. She slipped a shirt back on and tied the bottom over her hips. The torn deerskin dress beneath it still clung in places, the fringe frayed and the neckline gaping, but she didn't adjust it. I dressed quietly. There was no awkwardness between us. No need to define what had happened. It had been real, mutual wanted. That was enough. Over breakfast, River asked, "Do you ever think about leaving this place?" I paused with my spoon halfway to my mouth. "I used to. Not anymore. Because of me." I met her eyes. "Because of what I found when I stopped running." She sat back slightly. "I used to believe I'd have to go back, that it was wrong to want something else." "Do you still believe that?" Her response took a moment. Not now." Later that day, while I repaired a broken axle on the wagon, River remained inside and cleaned shelves, humming softly to herself in a language I didn't recognize. Her presence was no longer quiet in the same way it had been before. It wasn't fearful or distant. It was deliberate, rooted. She filled the space differently now. Without asking, without apologizing. I walked in and paused in the doorway, watching her stand on tiptoe to reach the top shelf. The shirt pulled tight across her back, her hair braided down to the middle of her spine. She turned slightly, and her eyes caught mine. "You're staring," she said with a hint of a smile. "Just looking," I replied. That night we didn't speak much. But after the fire was lit, River took a slow walk around the cabin, her bare feet making soft prints across the wooden floor. She moved toward the table, opened the drawer, and found a small ring I had once kept hidden. Clara's. She held it in her palm, then turned to me. "I saw this before," she said. "You kept it." I nodded. I didn't know why for a long time. "Do you now?" I think I was waiting for it to mean something again. She walked over slowly and placed the ring on the table in front of me. Her voice was steady. "I'm not her. I know. You won't replace her. You're not supposed to." Silence fell again. River looked down, then back up. Then what would it mean now? I took the ring, stood, moved around the table. I didn't kneel, didn't ask. I just held the ring out open in my palm. River's eyes filled with something close to shock. But it wasn't fear. It was weight. The weight of being chosen, not taken. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. She simply reached forward, slid her fingers into my hand, and let them close around the ring. That night she slept in my bed again. But this time she didn't lie at the edge. She curled into my chest, her leg hooked around his, her arm resting over my heart. Outside, the snow had begun to melt just a little. A faint drip from the eaves, the first sign of spring. We didn't talk about marriage. Not yet, but she stayed, and so did I. The snow softened into slush by the third week of March, revealing patches of earth that hadn't seen light in months. The fields were muddy. The barn roof still carried weight from the last storm, but the air smelled different now, less like ash, more like wet dirt and thawing roots. Spring was near. Inside the cabin, I woke to River, already dressed, crouched near the hearth and coaxing the fire into a steady flame. The shirt she wore was mine, slightly too large sleeves rolled to the elbows, and beneath it the familiar deerskin dress still clung around her hips, mended now with bits of cloth and sinew. She didn't look back when she noticed me stir. She just said, "Coffee is almost ready." I sat up slowly, rubbing the stiffness from my neck. "You sleep all right?" I asked. "You cold, not with you beside me." That quiet reply sat between us for a moment, heavier than it sounded. After breakfast, I went out to check the fence line. River joined me without needing to be asked. We worked in silence, side by side, setting posts and retightening the sagging wire. She moved with purpose, her hands calloused now from the months of labor. I had started giving her more of the tools, not because I needed her help, but because she used them well. At one point, she paused, hands on her knees, and stood slowly. My monthly didn't come this week. I looked up, uncertain if I'd heard her right. "I'm late," she said, her voice steady. "I've counted twice." I stepped closer, slow and careful. "You think?" "I don't know yet." Her voice wasn't afraid. It was measured, real. "But if I am, are you ready for that?" I exhaled once deeply. I didn't answer right away. I looked out toward the land, toward the sloping hills where the trees were starting to bud. Then I looked back at her, her strong arms, her steady jaw. her quiet gaze that didn't flinch anymore. "I never thought it'd happen," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Not again. Not this late. Not after everything. But if it's you, then yes. I'm ready." She didn't smile, but her shoulders eased, and then she leaned in, pressing her forehead gently against my chest. I placed my hand on the back of her head and held her there for a long while, letting the moment settle inside both of us. That evening, as the wind rose and the clouds gathered again, River stood at the window watching the trees sway. I brought in firewood. When I entered, she turned to me and said plainly, "If I carry your child, I want them to have a name, a home. I want to belong here." "You do," I said, crossing the room to her. "You already do." "But I mean fully," she replied. "Not as someone rescued. Not as a guest. As your wife." I set the firewood down and crossed the room. I didn't wait for ceremony. I took the ring from the shelf where it had rested since she placed it back days ago and handed it to her. "You sure?" She nodded. "Yes." I slipped it on her finger. Her hands trembled slightly. "Then you're my wife," I said. "Not by law, by choice. Mine and yours." That night we lay together without urgency. We undressed slowly, not out of nervousness, but intention. She let the shirt slide off her shoulders. Her body, warm and curved, met mine without resistance. Our breathing matched. Her hands found my skin with ease. When we came together, it was quiet like before, but this time with purpose. There was no past in the room now, only the present. Only the firelight flickering on our joined bodies. Only the promise of what came next. Afterward, she rested with her cheek against my chest. I stroked her hair. She whispered, "If it's a boy, we name him after your father." I smiled faintly. "And if it's a girl," River replied, "we let her name herself." I kissed her forehead, slow and deliberate. Then we lay still, listening to the wind move through the trees as if the land outside was starting to breathe again. So were we. The sun returned slow and golden in April, casting long, warm beams through the thinning clouds. Mud gave way to soft soil and the snow line retreated into the hills. I stood by the edge of the field, leaning on a post I'd set years ago, watching as River crouched by the fresh sprigs of spring onion she'd planted along the fence. Her belly wasn't showing yet, just a hint of fullness, a still quiet possibility, but her movements had changed. She moved with more care now, with intention. She touched the soil like it meant something more. She glanced up at me, shielding her eyes from the sun. "You're staring again." I smiled faintly. "I know. We hadn't gone back to Redstone Crossing since winter. There was no need. The ranch had what it needed, and what it didn't have we learned to live without." River had mended her own dress with care, piece by piece, patching the neckline and the seams with old linen I offered her. It still hung low on her chest, snug against her full figure, but no longer looked torn or forgotten. It looked like hers. The cabin had changed too. A second shelf had gone up by the table, hers for her things. A cradle, half carved and unfinished, sat near the hearth. A divider now split the far end of the room where she had once slept separately. It wasn't needed anymore, but we left it there out of respect for what once was. I still visited Clara's grave behind the cabin, but not every Sunday now. Not out of guilt. I went when it felt right. River had joined me once. She didn't speak at the graveside, just knelt beside me and laid down a single white stone. That was all. I think she said one morning while washing her hands in the basin, "When the baby comes, we should bury the old ring there." I paused, drying my hands on a cloth. "At the grave," she nodded. "Not because it's the end of something, but because it gave us this." I thought about that, then agreed. "We'll do it together." Around the second week of April, a rider from Redstone arrived with supplies. A younger man new to the route, unsure of Caleb Thorne's reputation. The rider tied off his horse awkwardly and approached the cabin while I stood on the porch. River was inside unseen, but she heard every word. "Brought what you ordered." "Tobacco flour, needle pack, salt," the rider said. He glanced around, then added cautiously, You still living out here alone?" I didn't answer right away. "Then number." The rider squinted. "You got someone helping?" I stepped forward slightly. "I've got a wife." The rider looked surprised. Not mocking, just curious. "Oh, huh. Well, town still got folks talking about that Apache woman from the sale last fall. Some said you took her in." My eyes stayed steady. "I didn't take her. She chose to stay." The rider shifted his weight awkwardly, then nodded and left the packages near the porch. "Well, sounds like she's lucky." "No," I said simply. "I am." The rider nodded again, a little more respectfully this time, and turned to leave. That night after dinner, River sat cross-legged on the floor, sharpening one of my old knives. The firelight danced across her bare arms, her collarbone visible through the open neckline of her mended deerskin dress. I sat nearby watching her with quiet ease. "You think folks will always talk?" she asked. "Maybe," I said, "but it won't change anything. I don't care what they say," she added, her voice strong. "I know." She set the knife aside and reached for my hand. I took it, letting our fingers intertwine. "Will you tell me about her?" River asked after a long silence. "Your wife?" I nodded. Her name was Clara. She was small, always cold, and she liked things tidy. She laughed loud, louder than anyone expected. River smiled. "She sounds nothing like me." "No," I said, "but she stayed. So do you." She rested her head on my shoulder. "Do you love me the same way?" I thought about it honestly. "I love you the way I didn't think I'd be allowed to again." River didn't reply. She just kissed my jaw and leaned into me. That night she placed the ring in a folded scrap of linen and set it in a carved box near the cradle. I watched her from the bed, understanding without needing explanation. The ring's journey was complete. It didn't mean forgetting. It meant making room. Spring came in full the next morning. Birds nesting near the eaves, the mule braying from the pen, a soft fog lifting off the hills. River stepped onto the porch with one hand resting low on her belly, the other shielding her eyes from the sun. I joined her, wrapping an arm around her waist. She leaned against me. "You still think this ranch has a future?" she asked, her voice soft with hope. I nodded, tightening my arm around her. "Because you're in it." We stood in the light facing the open land. There was no more silence that needed to be broken. No more past left to bury. No more question of whether we belonged. We had stayed. And in doing so, we had built something no storm, no man, and no memory could take away. A home, a family, a future. And for the first time in both our lives, we were not surviving anymore. We were living together for good, enjoying these epic Wild West stories. Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.